Welcome to the Why Factor, a chance to work out why we do what we do. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
Thank you for downloading this podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Shabnam Grewal, and in this edition of The Why Factor, we're asking why so many people are fascinated by zombies. Is it because they're often associated with an end-of-the-world type scenario, and you get to imagine what that would be like, whether you'd survive, or maybe even thrive? Or does a fascination with zombies allow us to work through fears and anxieties about the world today that are difficult to face in other ways? Fears about globalization and migration.
We're in a corridor looking through a door where a load of undead are busy eating somebody. There's a lot of screaming. We're trying not to attract attention.
I'm inside a derelict building somewhere in England with a group of around 30 people. We're all here to be scared out of our wits.
We've got to keep moving, we've got to stay together as a team. Don't split the group, you'll get lost, you get picked up and die. Hey, step away from the walls, please. Oh. Get that door shut, away from the walls. Get it shut.
The group is largely male and most people look between 18 and 40. And all have paid for the pleasure of experiencing the end of the world. Or at least one version of the end of the world, the one that involves a zombie invasion.
Okay, that was pretty scary.
Did you get the key?
Hello, I'm Shabnam Grewal, and this is The Why Factor. And today I'm asking why so many people are fascinated by zombies. Now, I'm a big fan myself, but if you're not, you may need an introduction.
It makes me think of mostly the walking corpse that's trying to eat me. It's a creature that's being raised from the dead and wandering around.
That's Professor Brendan Riley, who teaches a course on zombies at Columbia College, Chicago.
It might even be somebody who's paying too much attention to their phone. It's a really flexible word that we use in all sorts of ways. But like most people, I mostly I'm afraid of being eaten.
So the zombie is a walking corpse that's out to bite you and turn you into a similarly mindless, flesh-craving undead person. What's not to like? And we seem to be going through a bit of a zombie boom. Zombie books, comics, films, TV shows and video games are part of an industry estimated to be worth over $5 billion. The Walking Dead, an American series credited with bringing many new viewers to the genre, has regularly topped the charts in the US for audience ratings of adults under 50. But zombies have been around for more than 100 years. They first came to the attention of the American public through a book called The Magic Island about Haiti, written by William Seabrook in 1929.
It mentions the idea of the zombie, these corpses that are walking around. It was such an exciting idea, this idea that there are corpses that have been raised from the dead and are working as slaves.
Zombies? Yes, they are my servants.
This soul killer takes men from their graves to be his slaves.
It started to make its way into Hollywood movies. We see things like White Zombie. And my personal favorite of the older movies, I Walked with the Zombie. So we see these zombies as creatures that are controlled by magical priests and made to serve their masters.
The sinister power behind the White Zombie.
But some say there's more to zombies than a reliable source of Hollywood horror. Perhaps they tell us something about significant, deep divisions at large in society. a sense of us and them.
I explore it more through the way that zombies are depicted in American films, which is usually through this fear of the other. Mm-hmm. And so if you look at the movie White Zombie in particular, that's the movie that we sort of first see zombies in American culture. The fear, I mean, it's right there in the title. The fear is that that a white person would be turned into a zombie. This idea that they exist is sort of fascinating, but then the idea of a white person going to Haiti and being turned into a zombie, that's the scary idea in the film. And of course, it's a lovely white lady.
Captive in the borderland between life and death. Her brain drained of the life spark. The white zombie obeys the unholy commands of her demon master.
We'll come back to this idea of zombies and race later. But in the movies, the interest in zombies slowly grew in the 1930s and 40s, and then it really took off.
By the 60s, we start to see movies where the zombies are out of control. With George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, he and John Russo came up with a script that had these sort of walking corpses that tried to eat people, and they called them ghouls. They didn't call them zombies in that film. But after that, pretty much everyone decided that's what zombies were now.
So before that, they didn't eat people, and it's only after that that they began to eat people?
Well, pretty much.
And soon, the zombie norm was a shuffling, shambolic corpse intent on eating living humans and infecting them so they too became zombies. The only way to kill one was to destroy its brain. And when they appeared, it was often in an end-of-the-world or post-apocalyptic scenario. The hugely successful TV series The Walking Dead has former police officer Rick Grimes leading a band of survivors after an unexplained apocalypse has led to the end of civilization and to zombies roaming the world.
It wasn't that long ago. We were fighting just to stay alive. But it's not like that anymore. We're building.
A big part of what's fascinating and interesting about the post-apocalyptic zombie stories, where all of society has collapsed and you're trying to figure out how to make society again. How do you define ethics and morality? And in a movie or a story where people are building a new society, the first thing they have to do is decide how are they going to treat one another, what rules do they follow, what rules are not going to work in this world.
We need to start talking about making some rules. An agreement between all the communities. Like, this is how we treat each other. And this is what happens when we don't.
But as we heard earlier, fans no longer have to watch zombies passively at the cinema or on TV.
That way.
Someone take the phone! Just like the fear factor, I like, if something like that was going to happen, psychologically, how different people would react and how some people you wouldn't expect to react in a certain way.
I like the psychology behind that. So what would I do in that situation? And that's what intrigues me the most, I think, with something like this.
Yeah.
So it's a whole new, unique thing.
We run the events for customers all across the UK who want to immerse themselves outside of the real world, really. You see it on film and TV, and they come here and they want to act it out and be part of it and interact with the story.
Greg Rudman is from a company called Zombie Infection.
We run these events for not just fans of zombies, but fans of action and immersive theatre, really. The 6-hour overnight survival session that we do, we get people that come in and they're like, right, this is my test. Yeah, could I really survive an apocalypse?
On mark, we fire once into his chest, all together. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1, mark! On fire!
Enjoyed it more than I thought I would.
It felt quite real. I got quite scared at times.
Yeah, you get really carried away, get into the part, and your adrenaline gets going, and you're thinking, are you going to run out of ammo, and are you going to get out of there? But we got there in the end.
How was that for you?
Absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, I felt quite scared at times.
Yeah, definitely. Especially that bit at the end.
Because technically, I think it could potentially happen.
You have to figure out, A, how you're going to survive, B, where your resources are going to come from. and see who you can trust and who's basically with you or on your side.
This is Cameron Carlson. He's an expert in disaster relief and also a member of the Zombie Research Society.
Because the world has now changed, or your world has now changed, let's put it that way. You have to understand that everything that you did before is no longer a valid option. The whole concept of a world without laws or lawlessness where one person can become the quintessential American gunslinger, that vigilante justice, I think does play onto people's psyche, and it does create a bit of nostalgia. You can become whatever you want to be. There's not one person that I know of that if you say to them, what do you think of a zombie apocalypse? They would always say, could be fun. Could be fun. It comes down to being able to take a bad situation and make the best of it. You know, sometimes that allows people to reinvent themselves and become who they want to be and be, you know, a happier version of that. So the whole zombie apocalypse thing, I think, ties very much as a psychological aspect to it that ties it to why it's become so popular.
And is there another psychological aspect to the popularity of zombie culture today? Professor Kayama Glover from Columbia University thinks there is.
What's funny or interesting about the zombie is that even though one might argue that the zombie has to an extent become de-raced in modern 20th and 21st century representations of this creature, if you look at a zombie horde on The Walking Dead or in World War Z, they're not all black. Nevertheless, the idea of these sort of masses of expendable beings that are somehow coming for civilization, coming for our stuff, coming not only to take our things but to destroy them and infect us in the process, to me this is very resonant with some of the fears that we have about the global south and about peoples from non-white countries coming and invading with their culture, with their needs, with their desperation, our countries, right? So the very idea of the border wall to separate us from Mexico, the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, and the fear of migrants, dark-skinned migrants coming from North Africa and the Middle East to invade Europe. So I do think that the anxiety we feel about contagion, invasion, apocalypse even, and there's something strangely reassuring about media that allows us to see ourselves fighting these hordes and generally winning and not having to feel guilty about doing so.
So zombies, these fictitious creatures of horror films, do seem to be doing a lot of work. They serve as a gateway to a collective fantasy of a simpler world where everyone is more equal, gets to make the rules, and can become the best version of themselves. Yet, according to Professor Glover, they may also stand as a proxy for fear and anxiety about globalization and mass migration. That's a really big job for a mindless walking corpse that's just a bit hungry. Although, as we heard earlier, the first zombies who came from Haiti did not eat people and were to be pitied rather than feared, because they were effectively people enslaved by a sorcerer using some form of magic. As Professor Glover explains, the zombie
is conscripted to work in servitude to either the person who has had them zombified or to that sorcerer, either as a domestic servant, as a laborer in the fields, as a sexual concubine, any manner of way you can think of taking advantage of a person who has lost their will and is suspended in this animated state between life and death.
She argues that part of the reason the zombie became such a potent figure in Haiti is because of the country's own history of slavery.
Those years of absolute abjection and servitude as a colony, a slave colony of France, set the stage, I would say, for the understanding of the zombie as a social phenomenon.
And the idea of a person without will who could be made to do whatever you wanted, a mind-controlled slave who's never free, even in death, came to Haiti from Western and Southern Africa. According to Jean Komaroff, a South African anthropologist who teaches at Harvard University, interest in zombies arose from previous beliefs involving magic and witchcraft, when people felt they were losing control of their lives and of their labour, and
they saw themselves to have been zombified.
She returned to South Africa in the 1990s after Nelson Mandela was released to carry on her anthropological research.
When I had worked there 20 years before, the term zombie never arose. And when I returned after the end of apartheid, actually expecting to find a world of optimistic, this-worldly concerns with citizenship, progress, and so on, in fact, what I found was, I think one could say, an epidemic of zombie anxieties.
Professor Komarov thinks that worrying about zombies allowed people to show the fear and anger they felt about the effects of globalization and the end of apartheid. Feelings that were almost shameful, but needed to be expressed.
And this was at a time just after the end of apartheid when the country was liberalized in every sense of the term. For instance, the borders were much more open to immigrants who were often flooding the countryside in search for work. And at the same time, local South Africans were losing their jobs, sometimes to these immigrants, sometimes because there was a form of casualization and the outsourcing of labour overseas, because the whole South African scene had now been reintegrated into the global world in a new way. Many young people from the countryside actually migrated into the city, and often people lost track of their family. So people had the feeling sometimes when their kin disappeared and they didn't hear from them that they might have been taken as zombies.
People weren't just afraid their loved ones might be turned into zombies, but also that they were being used as slave labour to make some people very rich.
For instance, there was a murder in the mid-90s of a very wealthy local farmer on the part of a group of young men who had been activists in the struggle against apartheid. And they were part of a youthful generation that expected that now that apartheid was over, they were going to inherit decent jobs and a decent livelihood. And there was, in fact, quite the opposite. At the same time, some people, newly enfranchised black middle classes, were getting very wealthy. And where their wealth came from was never quite sure. And when they attacked this man, this young group, and in the end they burnt him to death, and one of the things they said was, it's people like this, they've zombified people, ordinary people, and they're keeping them hidden, and they are the producers at night of their wealth. And this was actually brought into a court of law by a local lawyer as a mitigating plea, that this was, a cultural belief, a very strong cultural belief, and people actually believed that they might set free these zombies if they put this man to death.
Again, zombies do a lot of work here. They explain unexpected wealth and provide a way of managing the feelings of anger and fear that are actually due to the uncertainties of the changing world. And that, Professor Komarov thinks, is happening again today.
I think the durability of these ideas and the figure of the zombie, the fact that it keeps coming back and people are absolutely captivated by it. People are trying to explain through these figures some of these enduring forces of history that don't kind of make it into the more conventional narratives, but they haunt us either through guilt or a sense of threat, and particularly at times, like the end of the Cold War, and now where we have a feeling that something in the global order is radically threatened, the whole kind of democratic liberal order that we know, these figures become the kind of receptacles for us to explore these fears and try and address them.
So that would be where the post-zombie apocalypse scenario would come in, where people are afraid of civilization falling apart and these zombies, and how would we survive that?
Exactly. And again, that maps into the concern that we may have made a Faustian bargain with our own fate, and we've condemned the planet to extinction, as it were. So again, that sense that those fears are really about forms of disorder and invasion, that we're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle this time.
It's a big thought that the zombies and our fear of them allows us to explore complex feelings and anxieties about what we're doing to the world, and how at some point we may have to pay for this. It's a very big thought, maybe too big for some. And it's not the only reason that zombie films have such an emotional draw. For me, one of the most enjoyable things about zombie films is that basically they're about relationships and other people. Cameron Carlson from the Zombie Research Society.
If you look at any of the movies, any of the shows, you're going to see that the zombies they start out as a focal point because that's how you intro everything. But as you get further along in either the movie or the TV show, the plot very much thickens, and now it becomes relationship driven. Yeah, it's absolutely a soap opera, and it's all about relationships. Every show that we see with zombies is all about relationships.
And if you add a threat to a loved one, that really ramps up the emotions and the appeal, certainly for Professor Glover.
Some of the most poignant moments in these media portrayals of zombies are the moments when people who are beloved by humans become zombies. And to that extent, I'm fascinated by zombie films. I'm fascinated by the moral conundrum that comes from that classic scene where you have a person who's infected dying in the arms of an uninfected person, and the uninfected person has to either, chop off their head or burn them, right? Do something to desecrate that formerly beloved body in order to keep the contagion at bay. The zombie's humanity is what makes it something that we can actually empathize with in a weird kind of way.
I think one thing we don't talk about enough as we talk about zombie stories is the fear of losing ourselves in the zombie. That often when we're watching zombie stories, we always imagine ourselves as being part of the survivor group. But I think that the frightening part of being a zombie is the idea that you'd still be in there. And for me, this question of which part of us is really interesting. And I think that the zombie story allows us to explore these questions of identity in a way that we don't realize we're exploring questions of identity, but we can think through some of these complicated questions. I would say right now the more interesting stories are the ones that deal with questions of mental capacity. There have been a number of zombie stories where they have a zombie that can think, or a zombie that can engage with the world more like a person.
Hello, Dr. Caldwell.
Hello, Melanie.
Morning, class. Good morning, Miss Justina.
Like the film The Girl with All the Gifts, about zombie children who can think and are aware.
It also allows us to engage with questions of people who have different needs or people who engage with the world differently, and to think a little bit about how does our society deal with people who have different needs.
Though I'm not done with the zombie apocalypse, I am really excited about these new stories and the ideas they allow us to explore. In the original Haitian stories, a zombie who was given salt would become free from that imprisoned zombie state and would run to a grave and lie down in it to finally rest in peace. I don't think that's about to happen to our zombies today. You've been listening to The Y Factor with me, Shabnam Grewal. This edition was produced by Ivana Davidovich, the editor is Andrew Smith, and the beautiful sound mix was created by Tom Brignall. If you've enjoyed this episode, you might enjoy other editions on dinosaurs, Antarctica, or the hierarchy of musical instruments. They're all on our website. And I only have one question left. Would you survive the zombie apocalypse, do you think?
I don't think I would. I live in a pretty heavily urban area, which makes it dangerous. I'm not particularly skilled with physical combat, so chances are I'd get bitten early. And I have 2 little kids, so I would probably spend a lot of energy trying to get to them or save them. Mm-hmm. But I'd be happy with my family. We'd turn into zombies together and go wandering around.
You'd be a zombie family?
Yeah.